everyone, let's get started. Welcome to the Wisconsin Historical Society and our Jerry Apps journaling presentation discussion. I'm Kristen Gilpatrick. I'm Marketing Manager of the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. We are proud to present The Old Timer Says, Journaling with Jerry Apps, in partnership with the Clearing Folk School in Door County, where Jerry teaches many of his writing workshops. So thank you to the Clearing for joining us today as well. We are talking today about something that Jerry has been doing pretty much most of his life, which is journaling in some way to record in lots of words or just a few words what's going on every day. And taking that inspiration, he's hoping to inspire others to journal as well. And that is why we've published his first journal. Let's see, I don't know, for some reason it's not showing up. Oop, there we go. The Old Timer Says. This is a new publication from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It is filled with, Jerry has a column, a blog as well, where he does sayings and things that he finds inspiration from and hopes will inspire, encourage, make people think. And so he has put those together, some of them into a journal, hoping that it'll help people spark some interest in writing about those topics or inspire something. I'll just read a couple from his journal here. Search for humor when nothing seems funny. I thought that was appropriate for 2020. There's no one can steal a memory, right? Especially when you write it down. Sometimes it's important to just breathe deeply. I think that's one I'm always going to remember. And Jerry will talk to us about how using little phrases like that can help inspire some writing as well, and how using your journal entries can make you a better writer and help you in your writing. But before we get to that, I have one other journaling note for all of our guests today. The Wisconsin Historical Society has a long history of collecting stories. We've been doing it since 1846, before Wisconsin even became a state. The press has been sharing stories in its books since 1855, so almost just as long. But this year, being such the year that it is, the Historical Society is hoping that people will help us collect the stories and document what this year has been. We're asking people to journal their COVID-19 experiences, whether they actually catch the disease or just all the different changes that we're all having to live with day to day. And so we have a whole 2020 COVID-19 journal project. And if you go to wisconsinhistory.org/journal project, you can learn more about it and sign up to do a little specific directed journaling on this topic that will help us and generations in the future understand what we are all going through right now. I also wanted to make you aware of some of the places where you can find more information about Jerry, his blog, his books. You can go to his site, jerryapps.com, or ours, wisconsinhistory.org/WHS Press. The books are for sale at the Clearing Folk School. The link will be in the chat. Many of his books are sold there, or any of your favorite book retailers. They're available at almost every library in Wisconsin and well beyond. And also, of course, wisconsinhistory.org in our store. And I just want to make sure I let a couple more people in. I see in the waiting room. There we go. Should be working. And with that, I'd also like to welcome our guest today, who almost needs no introduction, Jerry Apps. I'm going to see if I can unshare my screen. You guys have to pardon my...
I can see me up in the corner.
We should be. There's Jerry. I just want to stop sharing so we can see Jerry a little bit bigger. How about that? Well, welcome, Jerry Apps. Jerry Apps is the author of almost 50 nonfiction and fiction books already. Many of those books are actually based on journals that he's written, or pieces of a journal, or just one note in a journal, something that he saved, has inspired him over and over again in his writing. And I would just thrilled that Jerry is here to share some of the insights of journaling and writing with us today. With that, please join me in welcoming Jerry Apps.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Kristen. And it's my pleasure to be here. I guess it's afternoon now, on this kind of a dark and dreary day here in Madison, where I'm sitting in my office. What I want to do is I'm going to say a few general things about journaling and why I think journaling is important. I'm going to share a little bit about what I write in my journal to give you some insight into that. And then toward the end, I want to share a few of the journal entries that I have, because as Kristen pointed out, I've used my journals over the years, taking excerpts from them in many of my books. So to start with a few general comments, when you are writing in your journal, you're writing history. And what I say to my writing students, and I've been teaching creative writing for, since 1971, what I say to my writing students is, when we forget our histories, we forget who we are. When we forget our histories, we forget who we are. And journaling is one way to capture that history. Journaling allows one to capture the detail of our history. Most of us can remember generally something that happened several years ago, but most of us can't remember the specifics, the details. And it's in the journal that you write down the details of your history. You're never too old to keep a journal. I've had writing students in my workshops that are in their 80s and they've just begun to keep a journal. I've had workshop people in their teens who are just beginning to keep a journal, and there's no right way to do it. I'll explain something along the lines of what I do, but there's really no proper right way. There are no rules. Thou must do this. I write short entries. I write long entries. I write lists. I have drawings. I have photos, newspaper clippings, hopes, comments about current events, dreams, problems faced, joys experienced, the weather. All of that is grist for my journal. Now, what do I write in my journal? I'll show you one of the journals I have. This happens to be volume number 46. I have a closet full of these little journals like this. And this, Old Timer says, is, for many of you, can be your first journal if you've not done journaling before. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So what do I write in my journal? And I don't write every day. People think, well, my gosh, if you write every day, that sounds like a chore. No, I don't write every day. But most days, and I'll write 3-4 times a week, my journal entry always begins with the date, and this sounds a little weird maybe, the temperature at the time I am writing, and a few additional notes about the weather. I'm an old farm boy. Weather, I grew up trying to appreciate, well, not only trying to, but appreciating weather and keeping track of it. It's indeed the old farmer in me. Then I write down something that happened that day that I think was important enough to record. And it might be about my family. It's often about my family. These days I'm writing about my grandkids and what they're doing. It might be, I still run a little farm up in central Wisconsin, 120-acre tree farm. And so the entry may be about my farm. Sometimes the news of the day captures my attention, and I write that down, something about that. And sometimes I will clip out, I'll cut out a little news article and I'll stick that into my journal. And if my wife and I go to a play, something that we haven't been able to do lately, or we see a movie that's sort of interesting, I may put the ticket, a copy of the actual ticket. I'll just stick that in my journal. And when I make a major purchase, say I buy a different car or a new tractor for the farm, I record the model, the make, and the price. And that sounds, oh, why would you do that? Well, to me, it's so much fun to look back 20, 30, 40, 50 years. When I started doing journaling very actively and see what I paid for things. It's a way of doing history and doing comparative history. And I think kind of an interesting way. So what else do I do? Well, besides recording my personal history, and this part, some people may argue with me, but when something is troubling me, and as I get older, I guess more things trouble me than perhaps they did earlier. I write about that in my journal, and that helps me, and I think it might help others too. It helps me clarify my thoughts, my feelings, and my observations. By writing it down, and I feel strongly, I'll say about something about this later, the importance of writing in longhand. And some will want to use their computer, that's fine. But for me, there's something special about longhand writing in a journal. I'll say more about that in a little bit. If I run into some problem and I can't figure it out for the love of me, when I begin writing about it, sometimes that problem becomes solvable. Not always, but sometimes the process of writing about it helps me figure out how to solve the problem. And when something worries me, a health challenge, a family member facing a difficult time, a friend in some kind of trouble, I wrote about it. Worries seem to lessen when I see them written down. And my wife says I worry way too much. And I know others maybe that do as well, but writing the worry down helps me keep a record of it. Well, that's important, you may question, but it allows me to quit worrying about it because I've written it down. Writing in my journal forces me to consider what's important in my life. Because what I have written down, obviously, at least for me at least, is likely that which is most important. I don't have time to write down everything. Nobody does. So what you choose to write ends up being what's important to you. And this part may really send you out the door, but writing often helps me tap into my subconscious. A thought or a memory that I write about may trigger something else and bring to the surface a recollection that I didn't know was there anymore. Let me tell you a little story about a woman who was in my writing class at the clearing a few years ago. She was older, she was in her 80s. And she said to me in no uncertain terms when I began talking about journaling, she said, I have never written in a journal and I don't intend to start now. And I learned early on, you never argue with somebody in their 80s. And I didn't. I didn't say anything else. I just went on to someone else. And then and at the clearing, when in the week-long classes, and I know as Tammy is listening in, she knows this very well. She explains it to all of us. We all eat together, and we live in dorms, and it's a residential setting, week-long residential setting. And the morning after I had discussed journaling, I saw this woman coming down the trail to breakfast. And I said, I wish I hadn't said it. I said, Mabel, how did you sleep last night? And she said, I didn't hardly sleep at all. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't go back to sleep. I thought, oh my gosh, I wish I hadn't asked her about it. And she said, it's all your fault. Oh my, now I really was in trouble. And then she kind of smiled. And she said, when I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I began writing. And I wrote right up to the time that the bell rang, announcing that breakfast was being served. And I said to her, I asked her, what did you write about? And this is the part that I found most interesting. She said, I don't know. My hand was moving so fast. I don't know what I wrote down. I'm waiting to go back and read it after breakfast. Clearly, in my judgment, the process of writing got to her subconscious, got her thinking about things that she hadn't thought about for a very long time, no doubt. What else about journal writing? Well, again, a personal note. At the end of each year, January 1 or 2 or 3, something like that, I write down the happenings that I thought important in the previous year. I don't know why I do that, but I do. And I also write down, here are some of my hopes for the coming year. I've done that for many, many years. And it's kind of interesting to compare the hopes that one has with the results that one is able to see at the end of the year. I've done that for a long time. And as I mentioned before, it must be at least a half a dozen of my books now have references to my journal writing, and I'll say more about that in a little while later. Okay, so what are some of the practical considerations of journal writing? Well, I buy these little journals from a office supply store, and I'm hoping that many of you will buy this little journal because it's just a good way to get started. And much of what I am talking about today, I have in the intro to this, along with, as Kristen pointed out, some little tips on or triggers that may get you thinking. I buy sketchbooks, and I buy sketchbooks that have paper that has that's going to last a while, so it may cost a little extra, but because you are recording history, and I'm writing with a pen, not a pencil, somebody someday, maybe not, but I'm hoping, will go back and look at my journals and say, aha, this is what Apps was experiencing during the COVID situation. This is what Apps was experiencing when he had polio, as I did way back in 1947. I'm hoping that these journals will, for somebody, provide at least a sense of what this guy experienced. And by the way, when I'm writing my books, for example, my book on the Civilian Conservation Corps in Wisconsin, I have a whole chapter in there from a fellow who was a CCC member who wrote a journal. To me, there's no historical information that is more personal, more accurate, in my judgment. No, it's not been sifted out by anyone. It's the raw material. And as a writer, I go looking for that sort of thing. If I can find somebody's journal, that's a prime candidate to go into the work that I'm writing about. As I mentioned earlier, I try to write most days, don't write every day. And as I said, I'm on journal number 46. It takes maybe one journal a year or something like that. Okay. The Old Timer Says, that's this book now. I want to say a word or two it. In here is a summary of what I've just been talking about. But there are a lot of blank pages, and people say, why in the world are you going to pay good money for a book that doesn't have any words in it? Well, there are a few words in it. Most every page has an old timer saying, for instance, sometimes it's important to just breathe deeply. Well, that's one of them. These little trigger comments, I want to say a word about them, with these old timer sayings. I grew up in the 1930s and 40s, and my folks, we were farm people, and we had no electricity and no indoor plumbing and no central heating or anything, milk cows by hand. And when we got together with our neighbors, and that was often through thrashing bees and wood sawing and all that kind of stuff, people shared stories. And there was always somebody with a one-liner. And I would capture these old liners and I'd write them down. I had them in my mind. And then I worked as a county extension agent in a couple of counties and worked with farm people. And as I worked with them, I often picked up more of these old timer sayings. For example, let me just share a couple of them. There is, and by the way, some of them sound foolish until you think about them. There's less mud at the top of the hill. What in the world's that about? Of course, that's true. Mud gathers in the bottom of the hill. Well, it also, and most of you are onto this quicker than I probably would be, it's also an encouragement to folks to avoid wallowing in confusion or gossip, to rise above it all, to stay on the top of the hill. And many of these old timer sayings that I have in here, not only do I see them as triggers for your own journal writing, but they are a reflection of what was going on during the Depression and World War II. And I'll never forget, I was interviewing this fellow about how he saw, what he experienced during the Depression. And here's what he said. I was born with nothing, and I have most of it left. That's a fantastic statement. I was born with nothing, and I have most of it left. I wonder how many other people would agree with that. I wonder what you might want to write about that, because it's just kind of an interesting saying. So I want to read now, and then I'm going to spend some time trying to answer your questions, because I'm hoping you have questions. I want to read a little bit from this book called Rosh Journal. This is a journal book that I, with my son Steve, who is a photographer for the State Journal, a lot of pictures in it. I compared journal entries from an earlier day with a more recent time. And I thought that was kind of fun to do. And that resulted in this book. So now I want to share just a few of the journal entries to give you some feeling. These are excerpts from my journal. And now March 2nd, 1968. With the kids in tow, Ruth and I walked around the farm today. A few patches of bare ground show through the retreating snow on the south-facing hillsides. Green moss on these bare patches is a striking contrast to the worn and tired, but still mostly white snow. The pond level is about 18 inches lower than last fall, evidence of a snow shortage this winter. We stopped to rest in the white pine windbreak, and 5-year-old Steve asked, "What's that sound, Dad?" It was a sound of the wind blowing through the pine branches. I told him it was the tree talking to us. We both listened, each hearing his own message. That's the kind of stuff that I enjoy writing in my journals, and I'll share a couple of more. This is now May 4th, 2014, just a few years ago. Garden planting day, 2 weeks later than normal, as I like to get the cool weather crops in the ground by mid-April: potatoes, cabbage, lettuce, radishes. The whole crew is here helping: Steve and Natasha, Sue and Paul, and grandsons Josh and Ben. The grandsons have helped with the garden since they were little tots. They are now 18 and 21. Sue and Steve have helped since they were little ones as well, along with the little brother Jeff, who now gardens with his family in Colorado. We have grown a vegetable garden at Rosh since 1967. Rosh is the name of our farm. These days, the garden is large enough to provide fresh vegetables for 3 families. Gardening is one of many tasks we do at Rosh as a family. 3 generations working together, accomplishing the task and having a good time. Gardening has ranked near the top for subtly teaching my children and grandchildren about nature and the importance of soil, how things grow, and an appreciation for eating food that they helped produce. And just a couple more. By the way, there are these gorgeous pictures. I don't know if I can get this around so you can see it. The gorgeous pictures all through this book. So if you really get bored with the journal entries, you can look at the pictures. Hope you also read this stuff. May 31st, 1968. My dad was still living then, of course. My dad and I took the three kids fishing at the pond tonight. The bullheads were biting. Each youngster caught a little bullhead as fast as Dad and I could take them off the hooks. Steve had his net at the ready, really my trout landing net. One bullhead fell off the hook and lay on the bank and began flopping toward the water. Steve went after it with the net and was successful in capturing it, and he was mighty proud of what he had done. Grab it by the tail and put it in the pail, was the evening's cry. As we fished, frogs were singing their spring song. A frog jumped in front of Steve and he clamped the net over it. So we had a side lesson about frogs. By dark, we had landed 45 bullheads, each about 4 inches long. We put them all back in the pond. And just one more, I think, and then we'll wind this up and let you ask me some questions. Beautiful day, clear. This is July 22nd, 1968. Beautiful day, clear. Temperature in the high 80s. Last night, the whippoorwills were calling. One landed in a tree just above our tent and thrilled the entire family. We heard a deer snorting, then caught a glimpse of it. An owl called in the woods to the north. A few horse-tail clouds in the western sky turned from pink to lavender and finally black as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. Threads of steam lifted from the pond, creating a misty cloud over the valley. Smoke from our little campfire rose 20 feet into the air, bent 90 degrees, and trailed off to the south. I spotted bats swooping and diving as they plucked mosquitoes from the air. Finally, it was dark enough to view the expanse of stars stretching from horizon to horizon. And then the only sound we heard was that of crickets. That reminded us that autumn must be on its way. But in July? Now I'm more than happy to deal with whatever questions that you have or comments about your own journaling adventures. As you can tell, I am committed to the idea that everyone should keep a journal because, as I said at the very beginning, as we forget our histories, we forget who we are.
Thank you, Jerry. And we would love to take some of your questions if you guys would post them in the chat. Jerry can answer them. I have one already that I know of. And that is, people are wondering, everybody thinks they have to be a great writer to journal or write. I don't know if you can address that.
I can. It has nothing whatever to do with being a great or not so great writer. If you can put a sentence together, and even if you can't put a sentence together, you still are a candidate for writing in a journal. Everyone, being a gifted writer has nothing whatever to do with it. It's everything. Just here's what I often say: write down as you might talk. And if you really have trouble with this, talk into a tape recorder and then type it up or write it up, however you want to do it. But no, you don't have to be you don't have to be any kind of a writer. Just capture your own history. Write down what's going on in your life.
So I'm looking for some questions to pop up here. I would just say, my great-grandmother had a box that she kept in her bedroom, and she used to take the back of receipts and little slips and scraps of paper, and she would write on them, best baked beans ever, July 4th, 1941. And she put that in the box. And then, Grandpa brought me roses today. What a good birthday or something, August 1973 or whatever it was. And when she died, none of us had any idea she had that box. And when she died, it was just so joyful to go through all those little slips of memories, really. And you could lay out her entire life story right there in these little scratches of paper. So much as I want folks to buy the actual journal book, Sometimes a journal could be scraps of paper even.
I noticed in chat that Connie Wilsonak, who had been one
Yep.
of my writing students so long, indicated that she had stopped journaling and what would it take to get started again? Well, I'm hoping that what I said today might be some inspiration for doing it. Other than that, the only thing I can say is that sit down and do it. And I shouldn't be that blunt. For me, I write in my journal the first thing every morning before I start work. And these days, I've been writing full time now for, I don't know, 25 years. But the first thing I do in the morning before I do anything else in the way of writing or even reading emails or anything, I write in my journal because that is when I am freshest, I guess. And that's just me. I'm die on the vine by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but 8 o'clock in the morning I can conquer the world. So that's why when I write in my journal. So finding a time and sticking to it, and having a neat little book like this one is also kind of interesting because I'm very meticulous about these journal books. They're very important to me. They're some of my, if there's such a thing as a legacy, that probably is my legacy, my journals that are piled up in my closet. The good, the bad, and the ugly, and not everything. So, sometimes, I was an administrator at I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. Anyway, I was an administrator at the university for 7 years, departmental chair. I was acting dean at one time. But every so often, somebody would really tick me off. My gosh. And rather than confront them in my immediate anger, I would that evening I'd write them a letter, but I'd write it in my journal and I'd never mail it. And I'd feel so good about it. Can you imagine now going back and reading my journals? You're going to find some really good stuff. I don't know how good it's going to be, but anyway, I felt so much better about it. Somebody else had commented in the chat a moment ago that writing in a journal during these moments of COVID, when there's so much anxiety and fear and all the rest of it, is one way of helping to eliminate stress. And I couldn't agree more. I as I said early on, when I have some problem, some worry, the fact that I'm writing about it somehow makes it lessens it. It takes some of the air out of the worry balloon, if I could use that kind of a metaphor. Okay, what is Connie asking? I wish I had captured a teaching journal, and I can't. What's the rest of it? I missed it.
I wish I had captured a teaching journal and COVID teaching online. Any tips for capturing that? I have some notes of reactions to current Facebook page. I have an old lantern I just found in my parents' garage attic. There are so many aspects I could write about. What are your thoughts?
Well, other than just get started in doing it, and that which you choose to write about, as I said earlier, is that which is most important to you. There's no magical way of doing it. In my judgment, it's like any kind of writing. You got to just get at it. That's probably the most important part of writing. When my general writing students ask me, "Well, how can I do that?" Just get at it, and that's the most difficult thing for many people, is to find a time and a place when they can do it. And for journaling, again, a time and a place, whether it's 10 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is, helps.
That's what Debbie was just saying too in her comment. It says, it's interesting to me that you journal in the morning. I close my day when possible with writing in my journal. I find I sleep better when I put my day to bed in between the pages of my year. It just goes to show you we are free to develop our own style and a timing that is best for us.
Absolutely right. If you write at noon, or if you write at 10 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock in the morning, it really doesn't matter. For me, as a writer, it's kind of a warm up to my writing morning. I try to write every morning for 4 or 5 hours, and the journal writing is a warm up for me as well.
And then Mary Lou, just a quick question, Jerry, will you resume teaching your writing course?
And to be frank about it, probably not in person. I'm trying to figure out ways of doing it virtually, even after this COVID thing is over. I shouldn't have to fess up to this, but I will. I'm 86 years old. And there comes a day when and my wife keeps saying, when are you going to slow down a little bit? And I've gotten to avoid doing the traveling that I did so much of for a very long time. Thankfully, my voice mostly works in my head some of the time. The rest of me is sort of falling apart. But I love teaching. I've been teaching since 1957, long time. Taught at the university for 38 years. So I love teaching, and I'm going to try and do it in some way or another.
Well, you teach so much through your books too.
Sure, of course.
Mary Waterman says that a legacy is important. All I have of my mother's is a recipe book that she must have done in home economics class, but I treasure looking at her handwriting and the recipes she made in the 40s.
That's a very important comment, because my mother, who had a seventh grade education, when she passed away in 1993, we found a couple of things that became topics for books. We found her recipe box that she had used for cooking on a wood stove without electricity, without indoor plumbing. And that became the basis for a book that my daughter and I wrote called Old Farm Country Cookbook, which the Historical Society Press published a couple of years ago. So the legacy, second point on the legacy from my mother, was that she wrote down every nickel. She had account books, and she wrote down every nickel they took in, and sometimes that's about what it was, and every dime they spent, and that was true sometimes as well. And that became the basis for a book that I wrote called Every Farm Tells a Story, because those entries told me so much about what life was like during the Depression and World War II and in the 50s, when she and my dad were actively farming.
Different Mary Zimmerman said, I went back and read some of my early journals when I wrote about my relationship with my dad. I destroyed them because I didn't want my sibling to read them when I pass, as our relationship with dad is different. Has anyone else destroyed their journals?
I've heard that often, and people say to me, you obviously are going to destroy your journals, aren't you? Because you just fessed up to saying some things that might be very uncomfortable. And my quick comment was, I'm not going to destroy my journals. That's somebody else's problem to deal with what they read. I'm not going to worry about it. That was my honest take at that moment. And if you want to understand me, there's parts of me that you don't want to know about, but if you read the journal, you'll find out about.
Mary Lou says, I have not journaled so much as I have written in cursive quotations that are meaningful to me. I hope my children do not dispose of these when they eventually clear out my worldly possessions.
That's one kind of journaling, by the way. That's in the same category as the old timer says, where I have, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 of those sayings that I've collected. There's a goodly number of them in this book. And quotations, I find them fascinating.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Jerry? I'll give everybody just 1 minute here and remind everyone that the Clearing Folk School does sell many of his books, as does the Historical Society. And believe me, you can find them in pretty much every bookstore. So
I think everybody's just itching to get out their pen and start writing.
I've got mine.
Let's hope. Oh, and thank you all so very much for tuning in during the noon hour to hear me talk a little bit about my Johnny Appleseed idea of spreading the gospel of journaling wherever I can do it. And I've been doing that for a long time.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And I hope everyone stays healthy and stays writing. And we wish you all well. Thank you for joining us at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And thank you again to the Clearing Folk School for helping to host this event. Have a great day.
Thank you.